I have to say that it's really nerve-wracking to speak to friends when there's so many people you know in the audience. Strangers are much better, so I'm just going to envision a crowd of Cabbage Patch Kids. And you have to be careful about what you say, because you can't really, you know, make things up, you know. These people will catch you on it. So thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for taking time. I know everybody's got a really busy schedule, so it's really nice to see you here. I'm going to talk a little bit about this book because this is my little book that could. The way it came into being is a really interesting story in and of itself. Some of you may know and some of you may not know, it took me about 13 years to actually get published in New York. And I had written a series of manuscripts that had been submitted over the years. I've had several agents. I paid my dues. And between The Last Queen and The Confessions of Catherine de' Medici, when these two had been written and they had been submitted and rejected by like everybody that could possibly reject them, my agent at the time had said, well, I don't know what to do anymore. The genre doesn't seem to be very popular. This was before historical fiction kind of had its rebirth. She said, why don't you try to write something different? I thought of the idea of writing a mystery. And I'd never done one before. It had never really been a genre I had done a lot of reading in. It was never something that, you know, had really appealed to me that much. So I went and I read a bunch of historical mysteries, and all of them featured sleuths. It was basically, you know, a lot of them featured convents too, for some reason, which I found odd. And nuns who were sleuths, which I found interesting.
The power of the church.
Right, so I found it, so I didn't want to go in that direction. I thought that the market was really crowded to write another book that had a sleuth in it, that it discovers a crime, that has to figure out who murdered the person. I wanted to do something with a little more jazz in it. And I had also written these two novels in the point of views of women, and I wanted to do a dude for a change. I thought that might be interesting and fun to do. And oddly enough, for me, a challenge, because I found it relatively easy to write from a female point of view, but from a male point of view, I had never done it before. So I started to look around for some sort of theme to base this book on. And I've always been a big Tudor file, way before the Tudors were what they are now today, since the Showtime show and the big popularity in them. I've always loved them. When I was growing up, I saw the Masterpiece Theater, Six Wives of Henry VIII, and fell in love with Henry VIII and his wives. I was obsessed with Anne Boleyn. My mom said as a child I was just obsessed with Anne Boleyn. And I kept begging her for a little bee necklace, which she was like, little boys don't wear bee necklaces. Should have been a clue. So I decided the Tudors would be a great era to write in. That I thought, well, I could base a story in the Tudor era because it's an era that I love, it's an era I've researched a lot, it's an era I think I'd find really interesting to work with. The question was where? For such a brief dynasty, because the Tudors are really a short dynasty compared to other ruling dynasties, so much happened. And there's so many larger-than-life personalities. I wasn't quite sure who I wanted to work with or where I wanted to fit it. So I started reading a lot of different books on the Tudors and discovered this interesting bit of information about how Francis Walsingham, who was a spy master for Elizabeth, had developed this vast intelligence system to protect Elizabeth because she was a Protestant queen, and it was the time of the Reformation, and there was a lot of threats from the outside. And he developed this series, this network that kind of gave birth to what we know now as the modern intelligence system. So it was one of the most sophisticated. Walsingham had agents in every country in Europe, sort of moles and in embassies reporting back to Elizabeth, and they were all, it was just a network that was developed to protect her. And I thought, what a cool idea. What if I do a spy? What if I set something in this time? But as I read further into the period, I realized that what really appealed to me was to look at it before it became a vast network. What did it look like when it began? What would it have looked like before it even began? And so then the idea for this book was kind of born, was to write the story of a spy who will eventually become one of Elizabeth's chief protectors before she becomes queen. And then I had to look for a period to set it in. I had to find a time in history that would give me enough going on to set this person in that period. And I had already decided that I was going to do a fictional character intermixed with historical events and historical people and develop a fictional plot line, which was something new for me as well, because my other two previous books are based on factual evidence. One of the joys of writing those books is bringing those people to life, and one of the drawbacks is you can't do something different with them. If, you know, Catherine massacred all these Protestants, the Medici, it's just the way it is. I have to write the story based on that. But this book gave me a freedom to kind of explore a different side and use my imagination a bit more. And I kind of fell into looking at the Jane Grey period, which was a 9-day period between the time of Henry VIII's son's death and the rise of Jane Grey, who ruled for 9 days. She's really famous, Lady Jane Grey. She was beheaded. We kind of know her as this really tragic figure. And it's this tiny event in Tudor history that really isn't looked at in depth a lot, especially in fiction. And it's kind of passed over a lot in nonfiction. And yet it's this fascinating time when England teetered at the brink of civil war. Because with Edward's death and his protector, the Duke of Northumberland, pushing Jane Grey under the throne, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, who was a Catholic, Mary, who was supposed to inherit, was suddenly finding herself hunted. And after years of sort of being this neglected daughter of the king who had been declared illegitimate a couple times and had basically lived a retired life and had clung to the Catholic faith, all of a sudden she found herself thrust into the limelight. And then you have Elizabeth in the background, who makes this really fascinating counterfoil because she would have been the Protestant heir. And there's been a lot of research over the years and a lot of indications that Edward may have favored Elizabeth, but because he was ill, Northumberland pushed him away from Elizabeth, declaring her heir and declaring Jane Grey. So I thought, great, here's this cool, short period of time that I can set this story in. And I thought I had it all worked out, and I was just gonna go ahead and write. This book was the most difficult book I've ever written, because you were combining 3 separate plot lines. So I was combining a factual one, and I was putting a fictional guy in there. And I wanted to do just an ordinary man. I didn't want to do anybody but an ordinary man who carries an extraordinary secret. And when he comes to court, as he's drawn into the spy ring, it starts to unravel the secret of who he is. And I wanted to kind of play with some of the sort of time-worn icons that I loved growing up with. I grew up reading Alexander Dumas. I don't know if anybody's ever read him. Raphael Savantini was a kind of a swashbuckler writer from the 50s who wrote a number of novels that were made into films, usually starring Errol Flynn, oddly enough. So I wanted to kind of play with some of those iconography. So I wanted to do, you know, the ordinary guy who's got a deep secret. There's a birthmark in the book. When you look at it, you can see where I'm playing with some of these. I wanted to play with some of these old themes and make them fresh again if I could, and set them in this period. So I was trying to interweave 3 strands of a storyline into one cohesive whole. And this book literally just took so much to write. I had never written anything so challenging. And also, because the time frame was so tight, I wanted to make sure that it was fast-paced, it moved at a quick pace, and I had to wrap everything up in a way that made it a standalone book, and yet at the same time left it open for a series, because I had already envisioned a series, and my agent at the time had said, oh yes, series are really popular, we like to sell them. So I wrote it, we submitted it, we didn't sell it. Nobody thought that it was worth publishing. There was a lot of good praise about it, but there was a lot of stuff about it that wasn't. So this book kind of went back in the drawer, and I wrote another manuscript, and we went out and we submitted again. And I don't know, there's some writers in the crowd, but submissions are really painful, and you have to be really tough and kind of persevere. But I had been through about 10 years of submissions at that point, and when that last manuscript was rejected, I was like, okay, well, what do I do now? I've got all these manuscripts, I don't know what to do. And by coincidence, I met somebody who was doing a startup that was like a small independent publishing company. It was basically self-publishing, but he wasn't going to charge me for it. He was going to do a print on demand. And we self-published this novel as The Secret Lion. And I was really nervous about doing this because for years I had been told by everybody possible in the industry, self-publishing was a death knell for your career. You know, if you self-published, nobody was going to take you seriously. If you self-published, it was a sign that your writing wasn't worthy of being taken seriously by the establishment. So I spent a lot of time investigating how to self-publish correctly, and found out that there really was no correct way. Everybody does it differently depending on who they are. What I did learn was I wasn't